So William and I, we did this, me and William, we did this presentation at UCEA around standardized testing and the racial implications of data use. And I don't know that we knew what we were getting ourselves into when we started embarking on this, but it ended up being a fruitful conversation. And a couple of folks said we should bring it back to SOE. And so here we are bringing it back to SOE. Just a couple of things that you all might not know about William and I. I'll just gloss over this a good bit, and then I'll let William tell his story. But a lot of my interest in the racial implications of standardized testing and data use and standardized testing is largely because of my prior experience as a school principal working at the Department of Education. When I was at the Department of Education, the state superintendent used to make me train state superintendents on how to use the state's accountability model. Had nothing to do with my job description. But I often watch school superintendents misuse data in so many ways. And so a lot of my work is grounded in that. I'm deeply a son of the South. And so I've been retooling my research agenda lately to talk about critical education policy in the New South. And so a lot of this work shows up from that perspective. But the only other thing that you should probably know about me is that I am a New Orleans Saints fan, and that's not relevant, but always relevant in the football world. But William, you want to talk a little bit about how your positionality and how you come into this, and then I'll advance the slides because the next few years.
Yes, apologize for my tardiness, y'all. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm coming to this work as someone who was basically entrenched in neoliberal education as an early educator, particularly working primarily in charter schools. And so as someone who was traumatized by testing myself, who really, equated school with testing, I really struggled, you know what I mean, with having to, push some of this testing and data-driven culture that schools have. However, I felt like I could be a middle ground because I also knew the opportunities that sometimes these tests can also afford to individuals. And so I never wanted people not to have that opportunity. But framing it and making sure that they're humanized within it is really important. And also thinking about various types of data. So I'm coming at this as a former elementary school principal, as a science teacher, as a fifth grade, general ed teacher. And an individual who's also worked in central office, who's had to promote some of this, test-driven culture within a greater ecosystem. So I'm really particular about this as we work with our EDD students, and even in our EDU 704 class, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. We actually have them practice, making sure that they have this kind of anti-racist lens when they look at standardized test data in particular. You can go to the next one, Phil, and we can move on. And so I show this image right here, kind of talking a little bit about it. And when we were at the presentation at UCA, I asked the folks, like, how do they interpret this particular image, right? And the biggest thing that I wanted people to take away from this image is this idea that we have to start to really look at data as a double-edged sword, where it's something that could be extremely useful and strategic, particularly when it comes to anti-racist work, systems thinking, uplifting inequity. But it could also be used to marginalize. It could also be used to oppress, and also be used to keep individuals at a certain place and limit their resources. And so we want to make sure that we're very careful and not looking at data in just one light or one perspective, and understanding that in the work that we do, it could simultaneously change very easily. And while we think we're actually helping a situation, we could actually be hurting it. You can go to the next one. And so there's this quote that we put up there that I think a lot of times, kind of permeate within our school system. It says the age-based standards children are held to are essentially fake. There's no law of nature that says a child must read by X age or count by 100 by X grade. Children naturally learn differently, things at different times, and their lives are not ruined by a peer having learned something first. And obviously, how we actually measure somebody, learning something right now is, happening mainly, primarily through these standardized tests. So if anti-racist education involves humanizing others as well as disrupting, changing, and transforming inequitable systems, how are standardized assessments positioned, to help or even play a role in this agenda? And so we have to really think closely as it relates to how we're framing it, and understanding that resistance is key, but strategic resistance to it is going to be important to bring a longer and a more cultural change. Go to the next one. Ibram Kendi talks a lot about standardized tests. You know what I mean? He says that standardized tests have become the most effective racist weapon ever devised to objectively degrade Black and brown minds and legally exclude their bodies from prestigious schools. So when you think about, what the actual, metaphor, or what the actual exemplifying of exclusion, or in particular gatekeeping, we see that through the manifestation of these standardized tests. And so us taking a view of understanding that, we can't view the test and whatever the results of the test as being, the actual results or the standards to which, every individual holds to that person learning. We have to understand that it fits in with a larger system of resources, a larger system of hiring and teachers and students and everything else that we have to keep in mind when we're making decisions, and also working with our students within education. You go to the next one, Phil. And so this is a good article that just talks about how, in particular, the history of racial bias has, in essence, been part of standardized testing since the beginning. And obviously, the individuals that we mentioned that are suffering most are these low-income students of color that we're seeing. Even though we see these patterns, we always seem to find to make different conclusions, and think that there's different mechanisms that are actually going to fix those actual scores. And so when we think about it being used in the most overt way, I think a lot about one of the defenses that we had yesterday, Dr. Brandy Smith, who was really looking at how individual, particularly leaders, are facilitating alt meetings, and whether or not they're actually, humanizing and bringing in students with special needs in those conversations. And we also realize that students with special needs, are impacted heavily by this standardized test culture, while they, in essence, represent that floor that individuals, hopefully won't move upon, but use these standardized testing to actually measure, against them. So we have to understand that this is a huge, complex system, and they're very, very covert, but also very overt ways that it's playing out in the work that we're doing and hopefully trying to support. You go to the next one. And so obviously I mentioned before, neoliberalism isn't, something that's new to, folks, I think, in this space, but we have to also realize how it anchors a lot of the decisions around particularly standardized testing, and in how it plays out in a very racist way. You can go to the next one. In particularly, we think about how neoliberalism really takes this kind of business approach to kind of consolidate, abilities, and looking at how you order, the particular situation almost in like a private business. And so when we think about it, they weigh heavily, in particular, on specific outcome measures. And while I think outcome measures are really important, we have to, think really strategically and intentionally about how we're using this particular one outcome measure, the standardized test score, which doesn't necessarily fit all the learners, or even some of the types of ways individuals are being taught. And so when we keep this in mind, we also have to understand that this is a key element of resistance that we have to be aware of. And while we've been embedded in it and kind of integrated in it for so long, this is where it starts. This is kind of the root of it, and understanding that our mindset shift has to start with how we're looking at neoliberal education. Go to the next one. Yeah, and this is just another article from Leonard Taylor that talks about, just the neoliberal consequence, and just how data-driven decisions a lot of times subvert how we're understanding students' success. Even as we're going about, doing this on a higher level with higher ed, how we choose, intentional assessments are going to be the next wave. I know for me, I've been a real huge proponent of portfolio assessments and how we understand, individuals' matriculation over a period of time versus just one test that is supposed to signify that they've learned or haven't learned stuff. So I know Dr. Moss will talk a little bit about some of the frameworks that he's been also pushing and using within the EPL program, but also some of the things that he's experienced as an educator on the field. So I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah, thank you, William. William, I think you did an incredible job, framing how these ideas of a neoliberal education have manifested through standardized testing and also the way in which we utilize the data, which is where I'm going. But if you know anything about my work, I love Fisher et al., Weaver, Hightower, in that they have defined this concept of critical policy analysis, which I frame every lecture around this. And there's this idea that we've got to question all aspects of the policymaking process. Fundamentally, we've got to understand some of the assumptions that are guiding policy implementation. But also, we've got to ask questions around whose knowledge was prioritized when we actually built these testing policies and assessments, and also processes for actually utilizing the data from assessments. But we've also got to be hyper cognizant of the historical, socio-political, and geographic context in which policy has been made. And so it is that framework that I'm utilizing for the rest of this presentation. And so I'm going to be looking at the different policy decisions from this lens and frame. But I think that any education person should be reminded of our path towards accountability in America. You would have to understand that in the 50s, all the way to about 65, and in between that is Brown versus Board of Education. And between that is America grappling with what I call a conceptual realignment. And America's trying to figure out, what is this concept of education? And what does it mean? Who is it for? And how is it delivered? We move into 65 and 80. It's when we actually get the first U.S. Department of Education. I think it's quite interesting that 1979 is when the U.S. Department of Education actually started. But we get the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was about delivering resources to schools and systems. But there were a contingency of folks who argued that you cannot deliver resources to education systems, to states, from this perspective, without some level of accountability. So conversation started with Elementary and Secondary Education Act, thinking about accountability. America started trenching back, though, on some of this. And you could align your politics to this a bit and understand who was in office at the time. But I need not remind you, and understand this path towards accountability with the Education Consolidation and Improvement Act. Then in 88 and 94, you hear this America's 2000 plan, the Goals 2000 plan, which was the first time we had a set of national standards that we actually argued that states could voluntarily adopt. Again, America is on a path towards accountability. We enter the 94 into 2000, and it's where we start experiencing both expansion and friction with these ideas around accountability and testing. We see the Improving America's Schools Act actually fails. We name in 2000, America's going to have all kids reading by 2000. None of that happened. And so we see that plan starting to fail. Well, if you are a huge accountability advocate, and let me be clear with you, I believe in accountability. I often argue that if we didn't have accountability in education, children, I probably would have grown up learning basket weaving and basket weaving only. It was white members of the White Citizen Council in Mississippi who published an article after Brown versus Board of Education, who deliberately said, we're not going to comply. And so that that resistance brought about the need for accountability. I often say if we didn't have accountability, we wouldn't know who's learning, which in essence would tell us who's not learning. So in 2001, there was a breakthrough for folks who believed in accountability, with the No Child Left Behind Act. Now, we probably should have known, side note, moment of personal privilege, we probably should have known I was going to be a professor of education policy because I wrote my senior capstone project on No Child Left Behind. Weird, but I still have the paper to this day. And all the problems that I had with No Child Left Behind as a high school senior, like I really knew what was going on with No Child Left Behind. And so then in 2011, we start making adjustments. Folks start saying, we're not just like the Improving America Schools and the Achieve 2000 plan. We started realizing we're not going to meet AYP, annual yearly progress. Schools are not going to meet their goals. It's just not going to happen. We're not going to have every kid reading proficiently, you know, by the time the states have laid out in their plans. The Obama administration starts giving folks flexibility through Race to the Top, right? Now, that 2015 ESSA comes about. I would argue that 2016 to today, we're in what's called a discovery phase. We don't know who we want to be. ESSA is up for reauthorization. We've given states flexibility in terms of how they offer standardized testing, what they do with that in terms of accountability. I don't know that a reauthorization is coming anytime soon. I've got a group of superintendents who are going to the Hill tomorrow to ask for reauthorization. The architects of ESSA believe that it's a good law, it just has not been implemented. So I think it's important for us to understand America's path towards accountability if we're going to have this conversation. I'm also going to pause here and see if there are any reactions, thoughts, or questions to what we've shared prior, as well as any reactions or additions. I want this to be a conversation to America's path towards accountability. I would love to hear your thoughts here. And if you're just in listen mode, I understand, but I do want to make space if folks want to jump in. I see a comment in the chat. I want to get to it.
Yeah, Antonio mentioned this, that appreciates the historical perspective that's being lifted up, because I think that ultimately we have to understand how accountability has been translated, you know what I mean, the translation of it, you know what I mean, and the language, but also how it lives in these particular policies. But no, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it was key to put that glue together when having this conversation.
Yeah, I think Alita, you said your question was around how do I believe ESSA has contributed to the problem solution, if at all. So I think ESSA provided a set of equity guardrails for those of us who believe that the system needed a set of guardrails, and I think they do. I think ESSA also provided an opportunity for states to innovate around assessments, and none of that has actually taken place. I think there are some states that are taking up opportunity to learn, which is a new concept where we don't just measure accountability, we don't just use standardized testing to say how we're going to hold a system accountable, but we layer that with measures to determine what opportunities exist within a given school district for students to actually learn. So I think your question around ESSA's contribution, I think there are opportunities within the law, and this is the folks like Lakeisha Steele, who was an architect of ESSA. They argue the reason why we've not gotten to better assessments, more equitable assessments, and more equitable um, forms of school accountability are largely driven by a failure to implement ESSA to its full scope. So I do think the Every Student Succeeds Act um, poses unique opportunities for innovation with regard to both assessment and accountability. The question is, folks are not taking that up. Now, Louisiana did pilot, um, you know, Louisiana was the first state to say we're going to try something different. So they took the English language arts assessment and they said, rather than giving students cold reads at the end of the academic year, performing what I would call an autopsy on student performance, rather than giving students a cold read, we're going to utilize texts that have been read throughout the year to determine student mastery of a core set of skills and objectives. They were the first to do that. It is not translated to large scale innovations. And there are other folks who are now taking up that opportunity. But I think you do see its contribution in a way. And that goes to Antonio's question. I'll allow William to jump in here if he wants to add too. Antonio asks, do you think Race to the Top initiative played roles in it as well? I think Race to the Top theoretically was a strong idea. The full manifestation of that, and it was birthed out of the Obama administration saying, we get that you're not going to meet your goals, but in addition to not meeting your goals, we want to give you some flexibility to innovate within the system. Now, if you read the article that came out this week about federal spending on innovations and 70 to 80% of them were ineffective, that tells you what role Race to the Top would have played. The U.S. Department of Education put out these innovation grants, and when they ran quasi-experimental studies, they found that the effect sizes were often negative with many of these innovations. And so that might point to your question, but I'll stop here and see if folks want to add to the conversation verbally.
Yeah, and I would just add that, these big legislations, I think that you have various mindsets amongst leaders where some are very much wired by it and some are just really, really concerned about what's happening. And so I've seen individuals like assign an individual within schools to be like, okay, keep me up to make sure I'm compliant, but I'm about doing this particular work on the ground. So I see it having a huge, effect in regards to, like, a lot of my research is centered around motivation. And when we talk about this external motivation that's strictly based on punishment and reward, that sometimes isn't the most sustainable motivation for leaders. So I've seen it in that way, but I also, understand the context we're in of accountability. And if we don't have some type of measures, then there could be a lot of individuals slip through the cracks. So it's a slippery slope, but I've just seen on the ground people, work with it and have, varying perspectives because some people truly believe in it. And if you don't have the knowledge and wherewithal to kind of navigate some of those opportunities for innovation, then you're just looking at it as just some type of, big legislative thing that doesn't concern me. So that's just my thought.
Yeah, you know, you sound like Michael Fuller, the new meaning of educational change. You sound just like Fuller when you said that. William, I also want to I want to grapple with Rob's question. In 634, I often talk to students about, which is our ed policy course, about America's obsession with rationalization. We've tried to rationalize this education system, and it's often led to these accountability policies. Rob, your question was around, do I think NCLB didn't go far enough or was it flawed at its core? I'm actually a person who believes that NCLB was a good thing theoretically. I think that we know now what equity moves to make because of NCLB. I know that's not said widely. I think the challenge with a policy like NCLB, though, is that it was largely focused on outputs and it did not center inputs enough. And I think ESSA, and I'd love for Keisha to jump into this because I know she has thoughts around this too. I'm not putting you on the spot. I just love her thinking around this. We've talked about it in the hallway and and door to door. I think that NCLB didn't focus on inputs enough into the system, right? We had these stringent requirements, and that goes to your question around implementation, Rob. We had these tough requirements embedded in NCLB, but schools didn't know how to get it done. They often didn't have the resources to get it done. We didn't have the budgets to meet it, the human capital. This is also when, you know, we started getting all these research designations, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So we didn't have a lot of evidence, if you will, around school improvement efforts that have been built. But I think NCLB was actually, now NCLB was built because off the Texas Miracle from Rod Page, and I think that miracle wasn't all that true. Rod Page went on to argue that they essentially printed out workbooks and passed them out and sent them home with kids, and that's what got them reading overnight. How we got to NCLB, I don't know that I'm excited about. The goals of NCLB, I think, were beautiful and great. The implementation of NCLB and the supports aligned to it, I think is where we fell short. But Keisha, I hope you'll say something here.
No, I think you're right about that. I think one of the things that happens is that there's this decontextualization, right? In terms of not just how are we thinking about policy implementation, but also thinking about all of the things that buttress against this vision that some policymakers have when they actually create it. So I think about New York State and Race to the Top. The things that New York State argued in its grant application were never structurally possible in New York State, because when you look at the teacher contracts, when you look at how schools were structured, when you look at what the dominant practices were, when you look at performance, principal and teacher performance rubrics and accountabilities, all of those things were structured to maintain an avoidance of innovation. And so I think if you're not looking at that piece, it's really difficult to understand how the innovation can actually manifest. I think NCLB people were excited about because it unmasked some of the ways in which children of color were not being well served. But I think those other elements were not possible because of all of these contextual structural issues that states maintained. And New York, I think, was a big example of that. OMB, in one of their reports on Race to the Top, called New York State out in particular because it promised a lot, but never had the structural infrastructure to say we can deliver on that.
No, I think that's right. Andrea had a question that both William and I probably both can tackle too. Andrea's question was around teachers' role in educational accountability. I go back to Fullen and the new meaning of educational change. And he has these 8 factors that he actually talks about that affects initiation of an innovation or a policy idea. And one of the 8 happens to be teacher advocacy, which is why I appreciate the way in which Fullen has situated all his research. And I'm biased, and I don't think a student should leave a ed policy program or ed leadership program having not read Fullen. One, because I was baptized in it in my program. But 2, because Fullen talks about how we actualize change in a system. The factors, he talks about the external factors, right? Whether or not it's a union and the role that they play. But I think teachers have historically been represented as playing a role in accountability, but have not truly played a role, right? Through unions and the like, and folks tossing around how teachers feel. When you talk about present day, we did a report in Mississippi to figure out how much time students were actually spending testing. Mississippi First. We actually supported them at the Department of Ed with it. And it was the first time teachers really got into the conversation around benchmarking, interims, all of that, and how much time. So I think teachers are in the conversation present day, but I don't know if it's in the policy conversation. I think it's in the conversation around this is not working, but I don't know that teachers are at the table. William, you might have thoughts here too.
Well, no, they're at the table, but they're being directly affected, right? When you think about salaries and incentives and things of that nature that are all tied to this thing. I think that what resonates for me in this conversation is how schools are designing professional development. And while you assume that professional development is holistically developing a teacher to be able to really respond, a lot of it's just getting them prepared to take a test or, to be able to comply to whatever the policy is saying. So I agree. I think that, they haven't been, included, but I think that they have been included when it's convenient for, policymakers and those individuals who are trying to push the compliance.
And I think that this leads me to my next slide. Even you talking about that is so Jonathan Sapovitz, he identifies like these four theories for that essentially underlie testing policies. And one is motivational theory. He tends to believe, he says folks who do this testing work, who are obsessed with the policies they create, or they're creating policies thinking that it can motivate some level of improvement. And then there's this theory of alignment, that testing can spur alignment in our education system. I often, when I go to a school and they ask me to support their work, I'm always trying to figure out, is this a school system or is this a system of schools? Because it's vastly different. And so some folks believe that testing can align the system. And there's another theory called information theory, where it gives us information to guide improvement. Which is where I think we've actually fallen short in our work. It's like we actually, I think this theory is great. This is why I believe at some point, we'll talk about this in a minute. I believe we should be triangulating data before we make a decision about a student. We shouldn't just be using one measure to determine if a student graduates or not. My favorite thing to tell students when I teach about assessment and accountability is states saying kids can't graduate because of a state test is not ESSA. It's not a federal provision. That's a local provision. So I love to say that, because folks say, well, the federal government doesn't want them to move on if they don't master information. So we can't just use testing for information. No, states have built that negative incentive to try to drive students to do well on state assessments because of federal accountability. But the feds only require that you offer testing in 5th through 8th grade, right? And reading and math. One high school assessment. So we got to be clear about that. And then the last theory is around symbolism. And I'm going to talk about signals in just a moment and how testing data is used to send signals about a community. But there are folks that do this work in terms of policy from a symbolism perspective, in that these assessment results send signals about important values about our schools and systems. And we've got to be hyper aware of that. Parents make decisions about whether or not to send their child to a specific school or not, based on that notion. Next slide. So that kind of leads me to these 6 implications that we've come up with. And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is us playing in the park. We think that some of the racial implications of data use from standardized testing is missed signals about the quality of schools and systems. And I'm going to show you a graph in just a moment about these signals. But this data, when you use one data point or assessments that are inherently biased, it can send missed signals about whether or not a school is good or not. And given schools letters of A, B, C, D, or F purely based off one data point could not, there are schools that may not be an A-rated school, but it may be a good school for Latino students because the curriculum is racially affirming. They've got teachers who care about their racial identity. They've built strong parental relationships. And so we've got to be careful when we use standardized testing data because it could send mixed signals about the quality of schools and systems when we just have a one view of that. Number two, negative labeling of students, teachers, and leaders. Rob has done some work on this call to understand the way in which the DC teacher evaluation model, the implementation of it, trying to understand that. When Gates put all its money into teacher evaluations, many of them had a measure around student performance. And a good bit of this led to both negative labeling of students, teachers, and leaders, especially when your motivation is off, right? If your motivation is not about using this as information, it could cause one to negatively label students, teachers, and leaders. That principle is not good because their school's been C, D, or F rated. And that doesn't control for the inputs that I talked about earlier that have not been put into the system. That only considers the outputs. It doesn't look at the fact that we have an education system that's largely funded by property taxes. One thing we don't talk enough about is this third notion, obstruction of a community's values. This is why I love the community schools model that Keisha, Rob, and Ruben are working on. Because the community schools model puts these wraparound services, but also seeks to preserve and protect the community set of values. And if we're not thinking about the data that's coming out of schools and what a community cares deeply about and its own values, then we can obstruct that. And the way in which schools have gone over the last few years, there's a clear obstruction to values of a given community because we've centered so much our attention on meeting these proficiency demands, right? Or kids reading proficiently by the third grade are being held back. Side note, I support all the literacy work, but I don't support the holding students back. We did it in Mississippi. We've got a brief that's coming out that talks a little bit about the success or failure of that, but I wanted to highlight that here. What it does also is create these racialized hierarchies inside of schools and systems, and often the way we report out our data. The next one I think is ripe for us to talk about. It often creates social segregation in schools and classrooms. We've somehow gotten back to red birds, bluebirds, yellow jays inside of classrooms where we ability group students based solely off benchmark data. I was at a school in New York a couple of weeks ago, and I asked how the classrooms were organized. And the teacher said, oh, we took our benchmark data from the end of the year and we ability grouped them in classrooms. The classrooms were really organized along the lines of race and class. And so we've got to be careful with the implementation side. I think William has some solutions to that. The final one is one of my favorite ones to talk about. People often use these data from standardized assessments to justify established narratives about marginalized youth and families. I mean, you can turn on C-SPAN any day of the week in an education hearing, and you hear members of Congress using this assessment data to justify narratives that they've already built about the students who are in our schools and systems. I'd love to stop talking here and invite you all to share any thoughts or reactions. I've got solutions for all of these too, and we'll share those at the end. But would love to hear any reactions to this if this raises any questions, concerns, if folks like to push back on some of the ideas perhaps we've presented here, but would love to hear from you.
Yeah, I just want to just stamp what you were mentioning about obstruction of community values, Felton, because I think that, sometimes communities, unwillingly, what I mean, and unconsciously adopt the values of a school, you know what I mean? And a lot of times they start to, position what they thought was important, differently now that a school is saying that they have to do this. Whether it's, certain skills that they feel, like good life skills that the community values that might be de-emphasized within it. Things like the arts, you know what I mean, that some communities, for example, highly value that sometimes get now pushed away within schools because of standardized testing and having to take away this to having these types of courses. So I do think that this happens so implicitly as well as explicitly. And we have to really, really take time to understand what the values are. I'm not saying that not every school, community wants students to succeed academically, whatever that means. But we also have to kind of expand, how we're viewing them and understand that their values are complex and meaningful, and that we can't, utilize these school elements, what I mean, these policies to in essence, hijack what they're trying to establish themselves.
Others? We only have just a little time left, so I think we should perhaps get to so I think we should get to the last part here. I want to talk a little bit about how signaling policies have served as a policy driver. These signaling policies are policies that send messages to communities about the quality of schools, most often through A&F. And these signaling policies of what Ita Mizrav actually wrote this article about this, which I thought was pretty cool. He talks about how these testing policies that are signaling policies actually send messages to parents, and then they choose not to move in a neighborhood. And it leads to further obstruction of communities, and it leads to immense amounts of social segregation. And so what's really driving those signaling policies, though, are unfair school evaluations and ratings, and these harmful low expectations for students that we actually build inside of systems. And so anytime a testing or accountability policy is made, I often think to what extent is this policy going to send a signal about a specific community that could drive behavior that would impact other sectors of our society? And so we've got to think about the ways in which that impacts the housing market in a given community, or it impacts the number of jobs when folks are looking to place companies or businesses places. They're looking at these accountability data. And so we've got to make that connection between the way in which these policies around accountability, testing, and data use are sending signals about a given area. So how should we be using data? I think we should be using multiple data points. We should collect and disaggregate and share data above beyond reporting mandates. ESSA has reporting mandates. It requires states to have a report card. We should provide access to data on pathways and transitions, which I don't think most systems do well. How are kids transitioning to middle school? How are kids transitioning high school? All of your pathway programs, what is it actually looking like? What's happening with students who are taking different pathways? And then finally, when we use data, we should be engaging diverse and representative populations and how we share that data and how we actually talk about that data, rather than taking a white normative approach or view to that. So just to stamp, and then I'll allow William to come back here and talk about some of the work they do in the EDD program with practitioners to bring this out. But to come out and think about policies in general, I fundamentally believe that we should disinvest in A through F accountability systems and measure opportunities to learn. I don't like them. I think they're problematic. I think they send mixed signals, but I think that's one thing we can do. The next policy proposal I think we should do, when it comes to negative labeling of students, teachers, and leaders, I think we should measure growth of students from year to year and avoid a sole focus on proficiency. How much growth is being made from year to year? Because it's taking time to catch up learners who were impacted by a disequal system prior to now. And so I think that's one way. I think we should recenter the community's values in the design of learning experiences for students. Perhaps that looks like a community school model that goes a little further than just resources. If we're going to deal with the racialized hierarchies and social segregation in our system, I think we've got to disassemble these systems of social stratification, such as ability groups by performance. It stratifies the system. And then I think if we're going to deal with these justifying established narratives, we've got to reframe data conversation that lend towards using data to justify pre-established narratives. It means we've got to think differently about the way in which we talk about the data. Someone said something here. Yes, but yeah, I wanted to lay that out as ways to respond. And William, I think this is your slide.
Yeah. And so going, building on what you were mentioning in regards to just reframing data, we really push students, particularly right when they come into our EDD program in EDU 704, to really take a critical look at how their systems of data collection, data analysis are being used to perpetuate some of these, different ideas that hurt us. We push them, we give them various case studies to be able to look at data sets, but we really ask them to really, look at all the different labels and titles of the data sets and really, think closely about what's being measured. And more importantly, as you start to look at these patterns, outliers, which are going to be some of the decisions that you're going to be making, how are we thinking about the context of that? And so one of the things that we push folks to do as you start to look at these various data sets and particularly test scores is, what policy is it connected to? What protocols, were used to actually implement this policy? What was the processing of this particular policy amongst those teachers, particularly those who are in these testing grades? Are there certain power people that might be misrepresenting this in a way that might be putting added pressure to our educators and so on? And then also pushing our educators to think about their own positionality, their own experience with testing, and how that might actually directly impact practices, and ensuring that they know that numbers aren't neutral or what they call colorblind, that all these different elements can definitely be unearthed, hopefully to be able to give some counter stories to what marginalized peoples are experiencing. Go to the next slide. And so this is the book that we use in the EDD program from Edward Fergus, which really I like because it gives particularly our leaders an opportunity to see how you might be able to put some of these things in particularly a professional development setting. And so it gives them some suggested workshops that they could, kind of tweak and customize for their own space. But more importantly, it starts to anchor them in this idea of deficit thinking and making sure that we understand how this prevalent deficit thinking directly impacts how we look at tests, but also how we're making conclusions on specific students. Do the next one, yeah. And this is just an example of, kind of a short little case study where we would, in essence, look at, some of this data, particularly within a racial lens, and start to think about what is some of the patterns that we're seeing, particularly when it comes to like relative, risk ratio. And so while, our students unfortunately don't get a chance and to take a quantitative, analysis class, we try to make sure that we are building on their already, applied practices and skills that they've been learning within their spaces, but to really think about the lens and like what elements they need to be, really expanding as it relates to those conversations. So. Yeah, excellent. And yeah, I'll leave with you. I'll let you close out.
Yeah, I think we end with this Diane Ravitch quote that sometimes the most brilliant and intelligent minds do not shine in standardized tests because they do not have standardized minds. Um, as polarizing as Diane Ravitch is, I take all kinds of love in this statement. And I think I'm striving towards a system of accountability. I believe we should have assessments, but we must understand that, you know, some of our most brilliant, intelligent minds don't get to shine when that's the only way. And so we should be careful how we use standardized testing, how we build accountability policy, because it has implications. Well, folks, that's all we got. What questions y'all got for us? We'll stop sharing here. What y'all got? We got what, 6 minutes?
I'm gonna throw this in the chat, but hi, awesome presentation. I'm thinking of what you said earlier about how states and districts are making their own decisions about policies, and if you could just talk more about how these larger accountability policies influence something like what I put in the chat, like the DCPS policy, that teachers get an incentive when their students are at a certain percentage of their students that are a certain proficiency level, and where's the incentive for that last 15% of students, and helping them to get to where they need to be, not necessarily proficient, but just growth wise.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any thoughts before I jump in? So
Okay.
go ahead, Rob. I'd love to hear Rob's take on this for real.
I know. Well, I actually would just love to hear more about the policy, if you have like a link to that policy, Danielle, because DCPS is at least an impact. The teacher bonuses are based on growth, not on proficiency. They're actually, one of the most interesting things from the impact study actually was that teachers hate that component of it. I think partly because of some of the things that Phelton and William raised about like the lack of transparency. Teachers don't understand it. It's not actionable. It's not contributing to improvement, which I think are all valid critiques. But in terms of equity, that was actually the part of the system that was really doing the best by a number of measures. And actually things like race and gender bias against teachers, we saw were turning up a lot more in the observations by principals, more so than in the value added models, which do focus on growth, not proficiency, and also statistically adjust for differences in students' different starting points and different kinds of challenges that students may face and things like that. So I think in some ways this is something where it's still a pretty controversial issue, but I think it's at least in impacts, this is something that I think this is actually one of the better features of impact.
Did you get what you need there, Danielle? I will note that I'm not naive in the fact that the federal policies around, remember, states now have the authority to determine what AYP means for them. This whole notion of annual yearly progress has been moved out. But I'm not naive in the fact that the federal government does say you need to be showing growth, or you got to be put into these ATI, TSI, and all these different designations as a school. That's driven by federal policy. What I was talking about earlier, though, is districts know they have an end of year assessment, and now they're given 50 benchmarks throughout the year to try to say how kids are going to be performing by the end of the year. And it's creating an over-testing culture and a misuse of data culture. And that is driven by a federal priority. And I think the second thing I was trying to point to was that in many states, we've said kids can't graduate if they don't pass these standardized assessments. And that's not a federal requirement. A state like Mississippi actually put it in state law. So it's not even a board policy, it's state law that if students don't passed the end of course exams in high school. And then they did the same thing with third grade literacy. If you don't hit third grade literacy, you don't go to fourth grade. So those are some of the ways I was thinking about how federal policy is influencing state policy and then local decisions too.
I mean, I was going to add firing teachers, you know what I mean? Like how it goes all the way down to that, like, principals' decisions to let folks go and how much they weigh the test scores, growth or not growth, you know what I mean, to their decision. Especially in charter schools, you know what I mean? You can use that and, people are at will. So I think a lot of that can definitely trickle all the way down to the school.
Any other questions or thoughts? I think we have about 2 minutes. Is that right, Keisha?
You are absolutely right. If there are any, we have 1 minute. If there are any other questions, please put them in the chat. If you want to unmute yourself and share, that would be great. Otherwise, we can continue the conversation. I'm sure William and Phelton would be more than happy to keep talking with folks door to door, in the hallways, whatever it takes. And this is being recorded. We will share the recording. I'll check with Lumumba about getting that out to folks. But I just want to thank William and Phelton for this great presentation and this very important work. I think we need to, as Phelton has said, in that critical policy analysis framework, ask questions about the assumptions, ask questions about how we're moving from one place to another with the implementation of these things, and really start unpacking this. So thank you so much for your great presentation, and thanks to everyone for showing up for a really good discussion. Thank you.
Thank y'all. Y'all are amazing.
Thank you guys so much. That was awesome.
Great work. Great work. Thank you.
Thank you.